Ladies and gentlemen, a good evening to you. This is John Cameron Swayze reporting the news for the biggest car of the low price 3, Plymouth.
Plymouth, the car that's making news, presents the Plymouth News Caravan. The excitement, the drama of today's news today. Produced for Plymouth by NBC.
Messages of condolence have been flooding into Princeton, New Jersey since early this morning, when the death of Albert Einstein was announced to the world. A scientific giant who sometimes generated political controversy as well as brilliant equations, Dr. Einstein died at the age of 76.
Einstein, brilliant physicist and theoretical mathematician, died at Princeton Hospital in the same seclusion which cloaked virtually all his activities in life. Einstein entered the hospital Friday, died this morning after refusing surgery, which it turned out would not have helped him recover from a ruptured artery. He became a U.S. citizen in 1940, but his speech was heavily flavored with the accent of his native Germany.
The idea of achieving security through national armament is, at the present state of military technique, a disastrous illusion. The hydrogen bomb appears on the public horizon as a probably attainable goal. Its accelerated development has been solemnly proclaimed by the President. If successful, radioactive poisoning of the atmosphere and hence annihilation of any life on Earth has been brought within the range of technical possibilities.
That was an exclusive statement which Professor Einstein made for the NBC cameras 5 years ago, in which he warned that the products of his genius, atomic bombs, were a menace to mankind. The professor often left the scientific world to speak on moral and political issues, especially those posed by atomic energy.
Is there any way out of this impasse created by man himself? All of us, and particularly those who are responsible for the attitude of the US and the USSR, should realize that we may have vanquished an external enemy, but have been incapable of getting rid of the mentality created by war. It is impossible to achieve peace as long as every single action is taken with a possible future conflict in view.
This is the formula which summarized Einstein's theory of relativity, a theory which gained him a Nobel Prize. Einstein took mass, or the atomic weight of a substance, and the speed of light, which is constant, and expressed their relation to energy in a simple equation: E equals mc squared.
Another formula proposed by Dr. Einstein with a twinkle in his eye involves success in life. The rule, he would say, might be expressed as follows: success equals X plus Y plus Z. X being work, Y being play, and Z keeping your mouth shut. Now to New York's famous Hotel Waldorf Astoria for important news about Plymouth.
Arriving at the towering Waldorf, Mr. John P. Mansfield, President, and Mr. William J. Byrd, Sales Vice President of Plymouth. They're here for a special news conference attended by representatives of newspapers, magazines, radio, and TV. And now to Mr. Byrd.
Ladies and gentlemen of the press, the last time I talked with you, we were about to introduce our new 55 Plymouth to the people of America. The car was all new. It had new engines, 6 and V8, a new chassis, and a new body styled with a forward look, designed especially for the young in heart. At that time, I said we had great hopes for this car, but the proof, of course, remained to be seen. How would the people throughout the country react? I now have the answer. They love it. Judging by sales to people, not just production figures, this is Plymouth's year. The first quarter figures are in. They show an 85% increase over last year. It's the biggest January, February, and March in Plymouth history. Our present sales are running at the rate of 1 Plymouth delivered every 11 seconds of the working day, 6 days a week. We at Plymouth want everyone to know that we're delighted with this tremendous acceptance by people everywhere of the all-new 55 Plymouth.
Yes, Plymouth's sales are soaring. Plymouth's the biggest car in its field and the most beautiful car at any price. And remember, every 11 seconds of the working day, 6 days a week, a beautiful new Plymouth is delivered to somebody in these United States. The big swing is to the big Plymouth. Drive a new 55 Plymouth and you'll join that swing. See your Plymouth dealer tomorrow.
This was not a good day for the Reds at the Asian African Conference. Pro-Western spokesman took the play away from Chou En-lai, with the foreign minister of Iraq taking the lead as he called communism a form of colonialism that breeds hatred, and he was roundly cheered. Meanwhile, in Hungary, the communist regime ousted a premier who had urged a better life for the people and put in a man who was expected to be tough. Here at home, former President Truman had a field day in the witness chair, as reported now by David Brinkley at NBC News, Washington.
Harry Truman has done lots of other things, but today was the first time in his life he's ever been a witness before a committee. He enjoyed it, and so did the other people in the room. It's a Senate subcommittee looking for ideas for changes in the United Nations Charter. Truman was the first witness. Herbert Hoover and Mrs. Roosevelt come later. Truman avoided any specific recommendations, saying he'd had experience with people on the sidelines telling the coach what to do, but he said the fact the UN still exists is itself a hopeful fact. Then Senator Nolan asked him about UN members' contributions in Korea.
Frankly, I was not quite satisfied in feeling that it was effective collective security in action when out of the 60 members, as you know, only 16 of them outside of the United States applied any forces. Those 16 applied, if my figures are correct, approximately 45,000 to our 450,000.
Senator, I think the principal reason that a great many of the nations did not make military contribution to the effort in Korea was due to the fact that they were not financially able to do it. And I think that when the prosperity of those nations is increased by world peace, and they get into a position where they can function as active members of the United Nations, I think the vast majority of them would come across.
You would feel, would you, Mr. President, that if nations are to get the benefits, and we believe there are material benefits under the United Nations Charter, that they also, like a citizen of our country, assume certain obligations to contribute when their aid is needed.
I agree with that, and I think they would. And you must understand, too, in order to get some of our citizens to operate, we have to draft them.
And he added that he favors keeping the Russians in the UN where the whole world can see how badly they behave. Now back to John Cameron Swayze in New York.
Next, David Brinkley gives us his second report on the problem of school segregation. Now, last week he found the Carolinas spending more on separate schools with no plans for desegregation.
This week in St. Louis, he finds a different situation. 1 year after the Supreme Court decision for integration, the Carolinas and other southern states had not moved in that direction. But here in the border state of Missouri, the St. Louis schools launched a full-scale desegregation program in less than the year the court allowed for study of methods. At the time of the decision, St. Louis started desegregation in its special schools, then teachers' colleges, and then 2 months ago in high schools like this one. Elementary schools are next. Does it work? Correspondent Brinkley asked Philip J. Hickey, Superintendent of Instruction for St. Louis.
Mr. Hickey, you're winding up your first semester here since you ended segregation. How has it worked?
Well, we feel that the integration of the secondary schools has worked at a level much higher than even our best hopes would have anticipated.
Have you had any friction or difficulties of any kind?
With the exception of one minor problem in one of the high schools, which is a problem that we'd probably have had any day, and anyway, we've had no problems of any kind.
Well, why did you go ahead with it now instead of waiting for the final decision from the Supreme Court?
Well, our Board of Education, of course, is the responsible body in this community. And if you know St. Louis, that from the time that Jefferson took over this territory as part of the United States, there's always been a great belief in democracy.
Well, Mr. Hickey, as best you can tell, since you ended segregation, how do the students like it? Are they pretty happy with it or not?
Well, I think the students have taken this as just a part of the regular school life.
Here in Soldan Blewett High School, as in St. Louis' total population, the ratio of Negroes is about 30%. Here's what the students say.
Before the ending of the segregation came, the children in the grade school would fight each other. But they didn't even understand why they were fighting each other. They didn't even have a good reason.
Well, as far as I've seen, it's worked out wonderfully. I mean, we haven't had any trouble at all. And I mean, there are no instances. Maybe there were a few instances where we had a little, but it was not noticeable. And I've had a grand time, and I'm doing the best I can here.
Really, it's worked out much better than many of us expected. I mean, at first when we heard that segregation was going to end, we anticipated a lot of trouble. And I mean, there was a lot of talk in the school about trouble that might happen. But really, it's worked out fine, and I'm really glad that the schools have been integrated now.
Later this week, I'll be leaving for Nevada to cover the next atomic test. Today, the Army's big tank force left Camp Irwin for the same objective, and Roy Neal has that story at our newsroom in Los Angeles.
They took off from Camp Irwin in the Mojave Desert a few hours ago. A fully equipped tactical armored task force, 55 Patton 48 medium tanks in the lead. In a caravan that stretched out 9 miles long, they started a 177-mile trek to the Nevada Proving Grounds of the Atomic Energy Commission, where they'll take part in the big test scheduled for next Tuesday, the 26th of April. We'll cover that test, by the way, in color here on the News Caravan next Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And among the things we hope to show will be these men and vehicles. 800 men, 279 vehicles, participating in an atomic test. Although troops have been in trenches previously, this will be the first time soldiers have depended on tanks and other combat vehicles for protection against the atomic explosion. Their route of march for the next few days is a rugged one, straight across the desert and its dry lakes and over the mountain passes, skirting Death Valley, and finally, Camp Mercury and the big test. Task Force Razor, they call this tank battalion, and on the day of that test, it will deploy its units as closely as 2 miles to ground zero, and immediately after the detonation, will advance through the blasted area in a demonstration intended to test modern methods of armored warfare as it becomes atomic warfare. One of many unusual facets which should make next week's coverage from within the test sites worth the watching here on television. Now back to John Cameron Swayze in New York.
Two games in the major leagues today, Pittsburgh and New York. At New York, New York won 12-3. The other game, Chicago and Milwaukee, much closer. Milwaukee took it 2-1. Well, that's the story, folks. Glad we could get together. Remember to tune in the Camel News Caravan at this time tomorrow night, brought to you by Camel. No other cigarette is so rich tasting, yet so mild as Camel. And now this is John Cameron Swayze saying good night for the all-new 55 Plymouth, the biggest car of the low price 3.
The Plymouth News Caravan with John Cameron Swayze is brought to you by Plymouth, a great new car for the young in heart.